It was supposed to be just another Senate hearing, the kind of routine political theater most Americans ignore, filled with speeches, posturing, and carefully crafted sound bites. But on that particular day, inside the hushed chamber of the Senate Judiciary Committee, something unexpected unfolded. A moment that would ripple far beyond Washington, reshaping reputations, shifting narratives, and reminding a nation of what true leadership looks like. The room had been tense from the start. Senators seated in their rows, aides shifting papers, cameras poised, reporters' fingers hovering above their keyboards. The air, thick with anticipation of the usual partisan sparring, carried an undercurrent of fatigue. People expected another forgettable clash. Instead, they witnessed a masterclass in composure and authenticity. Adam Schiff, known for his sharp words and polished delivery, had the floor. He spoke with the kind of practiced intensity that fills news segments. His speech aimed at what he called the dangerous rise of extremism, at those he labeled as agitators cloaked in legitimacy. But then, in a move that seemed more personal than principled, he turned his gaze toward Senator John Kennedy. A smirk flickered at the corners of his mouth. "You, Senator," Schiff declared, his voice laced with disdain, "are nothing more than a thug in a suit." The word echoed. Thug. In that chamber, where words are chosen like weapons, it landed with a weight that silenced the room. Even some who usually stood with Schiff shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. For a brief frozen moment, all eyes were on Kennedy. They expected fire, a counterpunch, a cutting remark delivered with his signature wit. But what happened next defied every script. Kennedy didn't lean back or raise his voice. He didn't scowl or scoff. Instead, he tapped the microphone gently, the soft click of his finger filling the silence, and said one word. Interesting. That single word changed the room's energy. The tension broke, replaced by curiosity. Kennedy leaned forward slightly. "I've been called worse," he continued, his voice low and steady. "But you know what I haven't been called? Out of touch. Not by the people back home in Louisiana. Not by the folks who write me letters every week asking why Washington feels more like Hollywood than a place meant to serve real people." He paused, the kind of pause that invites reflection rather than demands attention. And then he shared what he'd brought with him, not talking points or charts, but the voices of those often unheard. A letter from a mother, working 2 jobs, unable to afford insulin for her daughter. A handwritten note from a young girl asking why the people who make the rules seem to live so differently from everyone else. Kennedy didn't need to raise his voice or gesture wildly. The simplicity of his words, the rawness of his examples, spoke louder than any insult could. The room, which moments earlier seemed primed for a fight, grew still. Schiff, taken off guard, opened his mouth slightly but said nothing. His insult had backfired. What was meant to diminish Kennedy instead elevated him, casting Schiff in the light of a man more interested in labels than solutions. Outside the chamber, newsrooms scrambled. Clips of the exchange spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with reactions. Hashtags trended. Commentators on all sides dissected the moment. But the verdict was clear. Kennedy had turned an attempted takedown into a reminder of why people are supposed to serve in the first place. Back inside, as the hearing stumbled forward, the shift was palpable. Schiff tried to regain control, his voice cracking slightly as he muttered that he wouldn't apologize for calling out extremism. But his words now sounded defensive, hollow. Kennedy, unshaken, countered quietly. "You just called the American people angry and manipulated," he said. "You sit in a city with the highest homelessness in the nation and haven't fixed a thing. But sure, lecture us from the moral high ground." Each word chipped away at the pretense that politics had to be theater. Kennedy spoke about gas prices, the fentanyl crisis, the struggles of working families, issues that rarely make it into grand speeches, but live in the daily realities of millions. The more he spoke, the more the room seemed to shift toward him, drawn not by performance but by sincerity. Schiff tried to double down, accusing Kennedy of throwing red meat to voters, of manipulating anger. But the accusation rang hollow because Kennedy wasn't angry. He was focused. And that, more than anything, unsettled his critics. Kennedy wasn't playing for headlines. He wasn't trying to win a clip for cable news. He was doing what so few in that chamber seemed to remember how to do. Listen, reflect, and speak for those without a microphone. Even when Schiff tried to pivot, suggesting Kennedy's party preferred grandstanding to negotiation, Kennedy responded without venom. Negotiating with who? The bureaucrats? The lobbyists? The unelected advisors behind closed doors? That's not negotiation. That's theater. What started as a petty insult had become something more, a conversation about who government is supposed to serve, about what it means to lead, about what happens when ambition forgets accountability. And in that conversation, Schiff found himself outmatched not by louder words, but by quieter conviction. Outside the chamber, the buzz continued. Reporters waited, hoping for another clash, another soundbite. But Kennedy didn't give them one. Instead, he walked through the halls, shaking hands, acknowledging staffers, interns, janitors, people who rarely get noticed when the cameras are on, and someone captured it on video. The footage spread almost as fast as the initial exchange. The caption read simply, "Kennedy doesn't talk down. He walks with them." By the time Schiff faced the press, trying to reframe the moment, the public had already moved on. His defense, that he was calling out extremism, fell flat. The story wasn't about extremism anymore. It was about authenticity. And in that story, Kennedy had already won. What followed was a study in contrast. Schiff scrambled, drafting statements, giving interviews, posting polished videos that felt too scripted to connect. Kennedy, meanwhile, hosted a town hall. No big production, no flashy graphics, just folding chairs, handwritten notes, and straight talk. When a teenager asked him if he ever got tired of fighting, Kennedy's answer was simple. "All the time," he said, "but I never get tired of defending the folks who can't fight back." That moment, captured in a 14-second clip, spread like wildfire. Because it wasn't crafted for virality, it was real, and that's what resonated. Kennedy didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to insult to make a point. He didn't need to win a debate. He just needed to remind people what service is supposed to look like. By the end of that week, the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about who threw the best punch. It was about who stood their ground without lowering themselves, about who kept their focus on the people who matter, not the politics that doesn't. In the end, Schiff's insult didn't humiliate Kennedy. It defined him, not as a thug, but as a servant, someone who listened, someone who remembered, someone who, in a city of noise, chose to speak with quiet conviction. And that choice made all the difference. If you believe that leadership should be about service, not showmanship, help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who still believes that integrity matters. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we'll explore how Kennedy's silent strength turned a single moment into a lasting movement. And remember, sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is the one that listens first. The dust hadn't settled from that now famous Senate hearing, but already the story had taken on a life of its own. What began as a single insult hurled across a committee room had transformed into something far larger, something that neither Adam Schiff nor John Kennedy could have predicted. In the hours that followed, the moment was replayed endlessly on cable news, dissected by pundits, and shared by millions across social media platforms. But what truly caught fire wasn't the insult itself. It was the way Kennedy responded, or rather the way he chose not to respond in kind. In politics, silence is often seen as weakness. A pause, a moment of reflection, is too easily mistaken for hesitation. But that day, Kennedy showed that silence, used with purpose, can be the loudest statement of all. As Schiff's words, sharp, rehearsed, designed to sting, faded into the background noise of a city addicted to outrage, Kennedy's calm dismantling of the moment lingered. His refusal to take the bait, to lower himself to the level of insult and spectacle, exposed a deeper truth. In a room full of performers, Kennedy wasn't acting. He was listening. It's easy to underestimate the power of restraint. To those watching live, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Senators shifted in their seats, their usual scripts failing them. Aides whispered behind folders. Reporters leaned forward, sensing that something rare was unfolding. Kennedy didn't fill the silence with anger or mockery. He let it breathe. And in that breath, the entire dynamic changed. The attention that Schiff had tried to seize with his barb now shifted entirely to Kennedy. Not because he fought back harder, but because he chose not to fight the way Schiff expected. In that stillness, Kennedy spoke volumes. His words about the single mother struggling to afford insulin, about the young girl who saw through the glamour of Washington, weren't theatrics. They weren't focused group-tested phrases designed for headlines. They were reminders of the people both men had sworn to serve. And that authenticity is what made the room, and soon the nation, take notice. While Schiff fumbled to recover, his polished facade cracking under the weight of his own miscalculation, Kennedy stood firm, not grandstanding, not posturing, simply steady, measured, real. What followed in the minutes and hours after the exchange revealed just how hungry the public had become for that kind of leadership. The video clip of Kennedy's response was shared not because it was fiery or sensational, but because it felt honest. The handwritten letter from the girl, the crumpled note from a struggling parent, these weren't props. They were proof. Proof that Kennedy wasn't speaking from some imagined moral high ground, but from the ground where real people live. Cable news anchors scrambled to frame the moment. Commentators on all sides rushed to stake their claims. But beneath the noise, something deeper was happening. The public wasn't just watching a political skirmish. They were seeing, perhaps for the first time in a long while, what it looks like when a leader puts people above performance. And they responded in kind. Hashtags praising Kennedy's poise and humility trended. Opinion pieces highlighted not his wit, but his restraint. Editorial boards, often quick to decry populist moments as empty rhetoric, found themselves admitting that Kennedy had done something rare. He had spoken truth without anger, and people believed him because of it. Schiff, on the other hand, found himself caught in a trap of his own making. His attempts to clarify, to reframe, to pivot, only deepened the contrast. Every polished statement, every carefully worded tweet, felt hollow compared to Kennedy's plain-spoken sincerity. And the harder Schiff tried to steer the narrative back toward his intended message, the further it drifted. Because the public had already decided what the moment meant. It wasn't about party lines or policy debates anymore. It was about character. Even as reporters begged for more, another jab, another exchange, another round of the drama, Kennedy refused to play along. He didn't gloat. He didn't tweet barbs or issue victory statements. Instead, he went back to work. He walked through the halls of the Capitol, shaking hands with people who rarely appear in press photos. The janitors, the interns, the security guards, and someone inevitably captured it on video. That clip spread just as fast as the one from the hearing. Kennedy, head down, sleeves rolled up, walking the walk while others still scrambled to control the talk. By the end of that first day, something had shifted, not just in the polls or the headlines, but in the mood of the nation. People weren't cheering for a fight well fought. They were relieved to see a fight avoided. They weren't drawn to the spectacle. They were drawn to the substance. And as that shift took root, Kennedy's quiet strength became a rallying point for those tired of the noise. The phrase started popping up in comment sections, on forums, in editorials. Do it the Kennedy way. A simple idea, but one that carried profound weight. The Kennedy way meant listening before speaking. It meant putting constituents before cameras. It meant choosing humility over spectacle. Meanwhile, Schiff's team scrambled behind closed doors. Meetings ran long. Strategies were debated, discarded, revised. Should they issue another statement? Should Schiff appear on primetime to explain? Should they let it blow over? But the damage was already done, because no amount of spin could erase the contrast now burned into the public consciousness. Schiff had tried to win the moment with a headline. Kennedy had won it with humanity. In the days that followed, Kennedy kept moving forward. He didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. At a town hall in a small Louisiana town, folding chairs filled a community center, usually half empty. People came not just to hear what he had to say, but to see if he was who they thought he was. And he was. No grand entrances, no entourage, just a man with a folder of letters, a stack of notes from people he had never met but had chosen to represent. When asked about the hearing, he didn't take the opportunity to boast or belittle. Instead, he said simply, "I didn't come here to trade insults. I came to speak for people who don't usually get heard. That's my job." One moment stood out at that town hall, captured on video and shared widely. A teenager, nervous, voice cracking, asked Kennedy if he ever got tired of it all. Tired of fighting, tired of standing up when it seemed easier to sit down. Kennedy paused, looked the young man in the eye, and answered with a quiet honesty that resonated far beyond that room. "All the time," he said, "but I never get tired of defending folks who can't fight back. That's what keeps me going." It wasn't a soundbite designed for virality, but it went viral anyway, because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. No fancy graphics, no dramatic music, just truth. And that truth, delivered without anger or theatrics, connected in a way that no amount of polished messaging could. Schiff, for his part, tried to recover. He issued statements about the importance of defending democracy, warning about the dangers of populist rhetoric. But his words, once sharp and commanding, now sounded like echoes in an empty room. The public wasn't interested in warnings about rhetoric. They were interested in results. And Kennedy, without ever raising his voice, had delivered something far more powerful than a retort. He had delivered a reminder of who elected officials work for and why it matters that they remember. As the days turned into weeks, the moment faded from the headlines, but it didn't fade from memory. Kennedy didn't need to keep talking about it. His actions spoke for him. Each handshake, each town hall, each quiet meeting with a constituent who never expected a senator to listen. That was the Kennedy way. And that way, grounded in service and humility, left a mark far deeper than any insult ever could. If you believe that leadership means listening before speaking, that it means service over spectacle, help us grow this movement. Subscribe now and join us on this journey as we explore the moments, the choices, and the people who are reshaping what it means to lead. Let's hit that first 1,000 subscribers together. This is just the beginning. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we'll break down how Kennedy's quiet strength didn't just win a moment, but started a movement. And remember, the most powerful voice in the room is often the one that chooses to listen. The clip of that now famous Senate hearing had barely finished airing before it took on a life of its own. In newsrooms across the country, producers scrambled to cut together highlight reels. Editorial teams debated headlines that would grab attention without sounding too breathless. On social media, the video spread faster than anyone expected, shared by people who rarely even paid attention to congressional hearings. And what drew them in wasn't the usual spectacle of politicians arguing. It wasn't the insult. It was what happened after. It was the quiet power of a man who refused to play the game. Adam Schiff had intended to make a statement that day. He wanted to frame Kennedy as reckless, dangerous, a man feeding off division. But instead, he handed Kennedy the stage, and Kennedy didn't waste it. His calm response, his choice to speak of real people rather than politics, struck a chord that no one in that chamber, perhaps not even Kennedy himself, could have predicted. Within an hour, hashtags praising Kennedy's poise and humility trended nationwide. Commentators who usually thrived on fiery exchanges found themselves praising restraint. Editorial boards that often dismissed Senate speeches as empty theater now wrote about the power of listening. What was meant to be a headline-making moment for Schiff had become something else entirely. a reminder of what leadership can look like when it's grounded in service rather than spectacle. News anchors filled segments replaying the exchange, not because it was dramatic in the usual sense, but because it felt genuine. Kennedy's words weren't carefully rehearsed attacks. They weren't lines designed to win applause. They were stories, real stories. A single mother struggling to afford insulin. A young girl asking why Washington felt so distant. And in those stories, people saw themselves. They didn't see a senator performing for the cameras. They saw a man speaking for them, about them, in a room that so often forgets who it serves. As the media frenzy grew, so too did the contrast. Schiff tried to regain the narrative, issuing statements about the need to call out extremism, warning of the dangers of populist rhetoric. But no matter how polished his words, they fell flat. Because in that moment, the public wasn't interested in political theory or high-minded defenses. They were interested in truth. And Kennedy, without raising his voice or pointing a finger, had delivered it. Reporters swarmed the Capitol, hoping for another confrontation, another exchange, another headline. But Kennedy didn't oblige. He didn't gloat. He didn't fire off tweets mocking Schiff. He didn't give the cameras what they wanted. Instead, he kept doing what he had done before the hearing began. He worked. He listened. He met with constituents. He spoke at town halls. And someone captured it. A short, grainy video of Kennedy in a hallway, pausing to shake hands with staffers and janitors. No grand gestures, no speeches, just small acts of respect. And that clip, too, spread like wildfire. Because in a city obsessed with optics, people recognized authenticity when they saw it. Schiff, meanwhile, found himself trapped. Every attempt to pivot felt forced. Every interview, every post, every carefully crafted talking point only deepened the gap between what he said and what people felt. He tried to turn the focus back to policy, back to the dangers he saw in Kennedy's approach. But the public wasn't listening, because no matter how valid his concerns, they were drowned out by the memory of a single moment where Kennedy chose dignity over division. In living rooms across the country, people watched the replay of that hearing not for the clash, but for the lesson. They weren't watching to see who landed the hardest punch. They were watching to see what happens when a leader refuses to throw one. And what they saw moved them. Because in Kennedy's calm, in his choice to respond not with anger, but with empathy, they saw a reflection of the kind of politics they wished for, but rarely saw. The media, always hungry for the next big story, kept trying to stoke the fire. They asked Kennedy if he considered Schiff an enemy. They asked Schiff if he regretted his words, but Kennedy wouldn't bite. When asked if Schiff was a political foe, Kennedy simply said, "No, just someone who forgot who he works for." And with that, he walked away, leaving the press with no soundbite, no fuel for more division. Just a reminder of who the conversation was supposed to be about all along. Editorials began to shift. Commentators who had initially framed the moment as a clash of personalities now saw it as something more. A referendum on authenticity. Podcasts dissected not the words but the tone. Not the insults but the pauses. Not the politics but the humanity. And again, the phrase appeared in headlines and hashtags. Do it the Kennedy way. Schiff tried to pivot once more, posting a lengthy thread warning about the dangers of performative populism. He filmed a video, polished and carefully scripted, explaining his concerns about where such moments could lead. But no one cared. The video barely made a ripple. The thread was met not with engagement, but with replies that echoed the sentiment of the moment. Do it the Kennedy way. Wasn't that people had suddenly forgotten about Schiff's career, or that his policy concerns weren't real. It was that, in that moment, his approach felt disconnected. People weren't asking for more speeches about the dangers of rhetoric. They were asking for action, for humility, for leaders who listen first and speak second. And Kennedy, whether by instinct or intention, had delivered exactly that. Even in the days that followed, as the news cycle moved on to other stories, the lesson lingered. Kennedy's name came up not in debates about ideology, but in conversations about leadership. His choice to meet insult with quiet strength became an example, cited in classrooms, on op-ed pages, in sermons and speeches. Because it wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about character. At a small town hall days after the hearing, Kennedy was asked about what had happened. He didn't launch into a prepared speech. He didn't attack Schiff. He simply said, "I didn't plan to be in a viral video. I planned to tell the truth. And sometimes the truth stings people who aren't used to hearing it." That honesty resonated more deeply than any fiery exchange could have. Meanwhile, Schiff's team debated strategy behind closed doors. Should he issue another statement? Should he go quiet and let the storm pass? Should he double down or change course? But nothing seemed to work. The public had moved on, and not in the way politicians hope for. They weren't forgetting. They had simply decided whose example they wanted to follow. What made it all the more striking was that Kennedy never seemed to seek the spotlight. He didn't tour the cable networks. He didn't post triumphant videos. He didn't turn the moment into a campaign ad. He just kept showing up, kept listening, kept doing the work. And that, more than anything, is what people noticed. In a city addicted to attention, Kennedy reminded everyone that the most powerful thing a leader can do is to put the people before the performance. Schiff had tried to win the moment with a well-timed insult, but Kennedy had won something far more valuable. Trust of people who felt unseen and unheard for far too long. And in doing so, he didn't just reshape that single hearing. He reshaped the conversation about what leadership can look like in an age of noise. If you believe that leadership should be about listening before speaking, about service over showmanship, help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who still believes that integrity matters. This isn't just a story about two senators. It's a reminder of what all of us should expect from those who serve. And it's just the beginning. Join us next time as we explore how Kennedy's focus on people, not politics, turned a single moment into lasting impact. And remember, in a world that rewards noise, the quietest voice can often be the most powerful. In the wake of that defining moment in the Senate chamber, something remarkable began to unfold. Something that few in Washington had expected and fewer still understood at first. For while many assumed the headlines and hashtags would fade, that Kennedy's quiet strength would be remembered as a single flash of authenticity in a city addicted to noise, the reality was far different. That moment wasn't the end of the story. It was the spark, and Kennedy wasn't about to let it stop at words. He was determined to turn it into action, and that is exactly what he did. While pundits kept replaying the exchange between Schiff and Kennedy, dissecting each pause, each word, each glance, Kennedy was back at work. He didn't waste time celebrating or grandstanding. He didn't tweet victory threads or release slick campaign videos. Instead, he focused on what had always mattered to him most. The people behind those letters he had read aloud. The mother struggling to afford insulin for her child. The families choosing between medicine and food. The voices drowned out by all the noise of politics, as usual. Kennedy knew that if that moment in the chamber was to mean anything, it had to lead somewhere. And so he chose to start with something simple, something urgent, insulin. It wasn't about headlines. It wasn't about scoring political points. It was about solving a problem that had been ignored for far too long. And so Kennedy drafted a bill, straightforward, practical, focused, a proposal to reallocate unused federal administrative funds to launch a nationwide pilot program for affordable insulin access. No gimmicks, no hidden agendas, just a clear plan to help families who needed it most. And with that, he set the tone for what came next. No shouting, no finger pointing, just work. What surprised many was how quickly support began to build. In a city where bipartisan cooperation is often treated as a myth, Kennedy's proposal drew interest from both sides of the aisle. Senators who had been wary of being seen as siding with a rival now found themselves quietly intrigued. Because the bill wasn't framed as a Republican idea or a Democrat idea. It was framed as what Kennedy called it in those first meetings, an American idea. The idea that no parent should have to choose between putting food on the table and keeping their child alive. The idea that no child should go without medicine because of a price tag. Kennedy didn't walk into those meetings with a big entourage. He didn't bring cameras or issue press releases about who he met with. He brought letters, real letters. He read from them. He handed copies to colleagues. He made the conversation about the people, not the politics. And it worked. Slowly, quietly, senators began to sign on. First one, then another. Some from his own party, some from across the aisle. They weren't signing on because of political pressure. They were signing on because Kennedy had reminded them why they had run for office in the first place. Meanwhile, Schiff tried to pivot, to recover from the fallout of their exchange. He issued statements. He warned about the risks of populist rhetoric. He tried to frame himself as the defender of democracy against dangerous oversimplifications. But his words no longer landed the way they once had. Because while he was talking, Kennedy was doing. And that difference did not go unnoticed. What made Kennedy's approach so powerful was its simplicity. He didn't try to outshout the noise. He simply refused to add to it. In meetings, he listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it wasn't to impress or to posture. It was to ask how to get the work done. And that, in a city starved for sincerity, became its own kind of strength. As the insulin bill gained traction, Kennedy kept his focus where it belonged. He held town halls. Not flashy events with big stages and bright lights, but quiet conversations in community centers and school gyms. He carried the same folder with him, filled with letters from across the country, not just from Louisiana, but from places he'd never visited. A father in Iowa, a nurse in Ohio, a mother in Oregon. Each letter a reminder that the work wasn't about politics. It was about people. Reporters kept trying to draw Kennedy back into the drama. They asked about Schiff, about the hearing, about whether he felt vindicated by how things had turned out. But Kennedy wouldn't take the bait. When asked if Schiff was his enemy, he answered simply, "No, just someone who forgot who he works for." And with that, he moved on. Because for Kennedy, this wasn't about settling scores. It was about keeping promises. The day the insulin bill came up for committee debate, the chamber felt different. The usual tension, the usual sense of theater, was replaced by something else. A quiet focus. A sense that for once the Senate was about to do what it was meant to do. Serve the people. Kennedy didn't deliver a fiery speech. He didn't point fingers or claim credit. He simply laid out the facts. He read from the letters. He reminded his colleagues of the families counting on them. And when the vote came, it wasn't even close. The bill passed through committee with broad, bipartisan support. What made the moment even more striking was that Kennedy never once mentioned Schiff. He didn't have to. The contrast spoke for itself. While Schiff was still trying to control the narrative, Kennedy was changing it. Not with sound bites, not with tweets, but with action. Cable news anchors, accustomed to covering political clashes, found themselves covering something rarer, a moment when Congress worked. And again, the phrase appeared, not just on social media, but in headlines, in editorials, in conversations around dinner tables. Do it the Kennedy way. The Kennedy way meant listening first, acting without fanfare, putting people before politics. What followed wasn't a victory lap. Kennedy didn't celebrate. He didn't bask in the headlines. He simply said, "It's a start." And he went back to work. Because for him, that was always the point. The work, the people, the promise to serve. As the full Senate prepared to vote, something else became clear. The insulin bill wasn't just about insulin anymore. It was about trust. It was about reminding people that government could still matter, that leadership could still be about service. And when the bill passed, it passed because Kennedy had shown that the quiet path, the path of humility and action, could still lead somewhere worth going. In the end, Kennedy didn't win by shouting louder. He didn't win by insulting back. He won by listening, by serving, by doing. And that, more than anything, became his legacy from that moment on. A legacy built not on a single exchange, but on what came after, on the work that followed, on the lives touched by a man who chose to speak softly and carry the voices of the people he served. If you believe that leadership means turning words into action, that it means doing the work without demanding applause, help us continue this journey. Subscribe now and be part of a community that believes integrity still matters. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. Share this story. Share this message. Because the Kennedy way isn't just about politics. It's about remembering who we're here for. And it's only just begun. In the next episode, we'll explore how this single act of service reshaped not just Kennedy's image, but the expectations of a nation hungry for real leadership. Stay tuned. And remember, true strength isn't loud, it's steady. The echoes of that Senate hearing, the hearing that began with a single insult and ended with something so much larger, didn't fade as the news cycle moved on. They lingered. They stayed with people in ways that even Kennedy himself couldn't have foreseen. In kitchens, in classrooms, in coffee shops, in quiet corners of small towns, Americans kept coming back to what they had seen, what they had felt. Because for the first time in a long time, they had witnessed something that felt real, something that reminded them of what leadership, true leadership, is supposed to be. It wasn't the insult that stayed with them, not Schiff's sharp word chosen to wound. That was forgotten almost as soon as it was spoken. It was what happened after, the calm, the steadiness, the way Kennedy chose not to fire back, not to play the game that had come to define politics in that chamber. The way he paused, breathed, and spoke of the people who had trusted him with their hopes, their struggles, their fears. That stayed. That mattered. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that this wasn't just a moment. It was a turning point, a reminder that dignity, humility, and service could still cut through the noise of a city built on sound bites. That a single man, by choosing integrity over spectacle, could change the course of the conversation. And Kennedy did just that. Not through anger or volume, but through quiet conviction. The passage of his insulin bill, once seen by skeptics as unlikely, became proof that Washington could still work when those within it chose to serve rather than perform. The bill, practical and focused, made its way through the full Senate with bipartisan support that surprised even the most seasoned analysts. Not because it was politically advantageous to support it, but because Kennedy had made it impossible not to. He had shown what was at stake. He had made it personal, and in doing so, he reminded his colleagues why they were there. But perhaps what spoke loudest was what Kennedy chose not to do. He didn't claim credit. He didn't gloat. He didn't stand before cameras and declare victory. When asked about the bill's success, he simply said, "It's a start." And that was the truth. For Kennedy, this wasn't about one bill, one headline, one vote. It was about building something larger, something lasting, something grounded in the quiet, unglamorous work of service. And people noticed, not just in Louisiana, but across the country. Letters poured in, emails, voicemails, messages from places Kennedy had never set foot, from people who felt, for the first time in years, that someone in that distant city had heard them. A retired school teacher from Kansas wrote to say thank you, not because she needed insulin, but because she needed to believe again that leaders could still care. A father from West Virginia sent a letter, handwritten, shaky, telling Kennedy that his son's medicine was now affordable and that he would never forget what that meant. Even Kennedy's critics found themselves at a loss, because how do you argue against sincerity? How do you spin humility into something sinister? Schiff tried in his way to refocus the conversation. He issued thoughtful statements about the dangers of populism, about the importance of standing guard against easy answers in hard times. But his words fell flat. Not because they weren't intelligent or well-intentioned, but because the public wasn't looking for analysis. They were looking for authenticity. And Kennedy, through action, had given it to them. What followed was something rare in politics: respect that crossed lines. At hearings, colleagues who had once brushed past Kennedy now stopped to shake his hand. Staffers from other offices, even those from across the aisle, greeted him with nods that spoke volumes. Not because they agreed with every vote he cast, but because they saw him for what he was, a man who remembered who he worked for. And as Kennedy moved through those halls, no entourage, no cameras, no grand gestures, the weight of what had happened stayed with him. Not as a victory, not as a vindication, but as a responsibility, a reminder that the trust people had placed in him was not a prize. It was a burden to be honored every day, in every decision, in every word. The media, of course, tried to turn it into a saga. They wanted a rematch. They wanted more headlines, more clashes, more drama, but Kennedy wouldn't play. When asked if Schiff was his political enemy, he shook his head. "No," he said softly, "just someone who forgot who he works for." And that quiet disappointment, not anger, not mockery, just sadness that a colleague had lost his way, spoke louder than any insult ever could. Across the country, that sentiment resonated because people knew what it felt like to be forgotten. They knew what it felt like to watch leaders argue while their problems went unsolved. They knew what it felt like to be talked at rather than listened to. And in Kennedy, they saw something different. A man who didn't claim to have all the answers, but who cared enough to ask the right questions. The insulin bill became law. Pharmacies changed their signage. Parents exhaled just a little, knowing that one burden had been lifted. But Kennedy didn't take a victory lap. He didn't celebrate. He simply said quietly, as he always did, "It's a start." And then he went back to work. Town hall after town hall. Community center after community center. No fanfare. No press releases. Just a man with a folder of letters, listening to the people who had entrusted him with their hopes. He met with veterans in small towns. He sat with teachers in aging classrooms. He shook hands with factory workers at shift change. And everywhere he went, he carried the same message. Washington likes to pretend it's a stage. But I don't act. I serve. One moment in a school gym outside Baton Rouge captured what Kennedy had become. A young girl approached him after a town hall, shy, nervous, clutching a folded piece of notebook paper. She handed it to him, her eyes wide. He unfolded it carefully. In simple, childlike handwriting, it read, "Thank you for reading my letter. You made me feel important. My mom said you gave us hope." Kennedy blinked hard, his voice catching for just a moment. He placed the note gently in his folder, right next to the others, and he smiled. Not for the cameras, not for applause, but because that was why he was there. In that moment, you could feel the weight of it all. The letters, the hopes, the trust placed in him by people who had nothing to give him but their stories. And Kennedy carried that weight willingly, because that, he believed, was the job. Schiff, for his part, tried to regroup. He issued statements congratulating Kennedy on the bill's success. But the public had already moved on, not because they no longer cared, but because they had already chosen who they believed. Schiff wasn't the villain of the story. He was simply the reminder of what happens when leaders lose sight of who they serve. In private, Kennedy often said he didn't want to be remembered for that hearing. He didn't want that to be his legacy. What he wanted, what he hoped for, was that people would remember the work that followed. The quiet meetings, the long nights reading letters, the bills written not for headlines, but for the people who needed them. And slowly, that is what began to happen. The phrase that started as a social media slogan, "Do it the Kennedy way," became something more. It became a standard, a quiet rebellion against performative politics, a reminder that strength isn't in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your service. That leadership isn't about winning arguments, it's about earning trust. And so Kennedy kept going, day after day, week after week, not for applause, not for votes, but because he believed with everything he had that that was what the job demanded. And in doing so, he changed not just the conversation in Washington, but the expectations of a nation. If you believe that leadership should be measured not in sound bites, but in service, if you believe that integrity still matters, if you believe that politics can be better, that leaders can be better, then help us keep this conversation going. Subscribe now. Join us. Help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers and beyond. Share this story. Share this hope. Because the Kennedy way isn't about one man. It's about all of us. And it's only just begun.